All right, everyone. Happy Columbus Day. Yes, indeed, by presidential proclamation. We're back to actually having Columbus Day instead of the mythology of Indigenous Peoples Day. I'm going to be ranting a little bit about that. I enjoy this. The idea of there being an indigenous people that is special to the North American continent is quite clearly wrong. Most of the population was scattered around. They were hunter-gatherers and so forth prior to European contact. There were some settlements. There were the mound builders, which disappeared. We're not exactly sure what happened with them. For the most part, you have tribes that are loosely associated sometimes, and then they give one another wampum and smoke the peace pipe, supposedly. Oh, wait, that's actually a mythology. None of these things are actually real. Most of what you think that you know about the so-called indigenous peoples within what became the United States and Canada and Mexico and so forth is nothing more than a filthy lie, actually. These groups of people attacked one another habitually. They overran one another and took possession of land that was there. They would enslave one another. They scalped one another. These are real, actual things. When we're told, therefore, that we're supposed to support the indigenous people, we need to celebrate their glorious victories. What fucking victory are you celebrating? Because I can't name any. Now, there were a handful of instances in which a bunch of people would break into a local village and kill everyone. Other than that, there's not a whole lot to go on. Europeans coming to what became the United States and America in general civilized it. That's just, there's no other way to put it. They civilized it. Were there mistakes made? Yes. Were there problems? Yes. Was there abuse? Yeah, there were plenty of instances of Columbus and people like that enslaving the Taino, for example, down in the Caribbean and so forth, and making them dig for gold, and they would cut off their hands in these sort of Belgian mode, and there was a lot of abuse that went on. How is this different from what was already going on? It wasn't. The idea of some hedonistic population of redskins, as they would have called them back then, living in harmony and worshiping the Great Spirit and smoking the peace pipe, this is a mythology that was built in the 1800s. It is nothing more than neo-romanticism. And the left is guilty of this at the moment. They have this neo-romanticist, ironically from the mid-1800s, view of the people that were here. Oh my, they lived in the spirit with nature, and they loved the trees, and they always, whenever they killed something that they had to eat, they gave praise to the Holy Spirit, and then they gave praise to the animal and stuff. Thank you for sacrificing yourself. I know you died painfully, but now I'm going to eat you. But I thank you for your sacrifice. It's very, very backwards logic that's being used to actually look at the indigenous people, so-called. And they're not even indigenous. The only indigenous people in the Americas, arguably, according to every bit of archaeological evidence, oddly enough, and this is hysterical, it's one of the funniest things ever. It could have been one of Elizabeth Warren's distant relatives, but not Cherokee, Peruvian, apparently. This appears to actually be the case. Elizabeth Warren is, 1/1000th Peruvian or something like that. Those individuals, they came over by boats far further, by the way, tens of thousands of years before anyone crossed the Bering, and it does appear that they did form an indigenous population. That's the closest thing that you're going to get to indigenous within the American continents. They simply weren't populated by humans before. Humans didn't have the technological capability of actually entering the Americas, other than maybe the Romans. There's always wild stories, and it could be true. I think that the jury's out on this one, but there's one story where they're like maybe a Roman trireme managed to make it to the Americas. And they did have that weird old Greek statue head, actually, that they found at one point that appears to be out of place. So it is possible. But other than that, it's really a bunch of Peruvians, actually, more than anything else. So happy Columbus Day. I'll be celebrating it by doing absolutely nothing other than making my normal videos because Columbus never actually set foot on the contiguous United States of America, although he did set foot on Puerto Rico, so since it's a U.S. territory, we'll give him a pass on that one. But I'm not going to be celebrating Indigenous Peoples Day. I'm not going to celebrate savagery and barbarity, which is literally what they operated under. These people were not civilized. It's just a fact. While people in other countries were, milling arms and creating ships that are 100 feet long, although Columbus's biggest ship, I believe, was only 70 feet long. Not exactly what you would want to sail across the Atlantic on. You can only imagine the conditions aboard that fucking deck. While they were doing all of these things, the people that were actually in what became the United States were living in the Stone Age. Literally living in the Stone Age. There was no, in some cases, there was no writing system. There was no, they didn't do metal forging, certainly not on the same level as the Europeans were doing. And the idea that they had this pastoral, happy lifestyle, they were basically like nymphs and dryads frolicking around in the forest in ancient Greece or something. That's nothing more than a myth that was created later. It was a backlash to the industrial era. It was a backlash to the coal soot and to the furnaces and to machinations beyond people's capability in some cases of even understanding. It was just a backlash against that. So Europe, it's becoming industrialized and there's smoke everywhere and stuff like that. And they're like, well, there's got to be something better than this. Oh, that new world over there is awfully green. Yeah, 99% of it's uninhabited. Here's the key. It was uninhabited not because Europeans came and gave them pox blankets, but because these people never rose above the level of hunter-gatherer. They never developed a sedentary sort of system. There were tribes that did, especially on the eastern seaboard and parts of the Southwest as well. They did have stable homes, they had corrals, and all of these other things. So they had developed that. Most of the country, though, or what became the country, most of it was seldom inhabited at all. Most of it was basically empty. You look at the Louisiana Purchase and stuff. Only a handful of tribes were ever contacted on that particular campaign. By the way, they loved those Giordoni rifles, actually, the pneumatic rifles that they had. Apparently, those were quite impressive to people. It bought at a very high price. And now you can get pneumatic rifles that will kill an elk. Again, there's the way that things work, and then there's the way that they can work. There's an advance over time. But those tribes were never under the kind of stress necessary to actually innovate things, for the most part. They were still fighting with spears and with rudimentary bows and stuff like that. So you'll excuse me if I look at this, well, various groups of people. They're doing the slavery thing. So liberals, they had slaves, believe it or not. They're enslaving people, they're butchering people, they're fighting over land, they're fighting over the pretty woman and stuff like that, just the same as the Europeans were doing, just with less technology. So I don't give a fuck about Indigenous Peoples Day, and partially, I'm supposedly Abenaki, but I don't care about that lineage. I am broadly European diaspora. And, liberals will probably say, well, why don't you, wear a couple of moose horns on your head and go and commune with the Great Spirit? Fuck your Great Spirit. I don't give a shit. That's about all. Peace out.